So
Okay. As you say,
let's do it.
Whatever you wish. Okay.
Let's start on time.
Okay, guys. First things first. Whoever is putting up a stuff on the chat box, please, let us know where you are from, and also please do address all panelists and attendees. Sometimes people tend to address just the panelists, and so the rest of the people do not really get the message. So, and unfortunately, the default on Zoom, I think, happens to be all panelists. So you need to go there and change all panelists and attendees. Okay, before we get into the subject and I introduce the relevance of it and why we have chosen this today, if there is anybody out there who has some experience of actually having trained in Barrett, both Dharmesh and I have used Barrett, knowledge of Barrett, worked with people who have done Barrett, but we have not formally trained in Barrett. So any of you who out there has been trained or certified in Barrett, please let us know, and whether you would like to come into the panel. We would very much like you, if you have a certification or being trained, so you can bring a completely different perspective to what we're going to discuss today. Okay, so let me go into the reason why we selected this. And once again, like in a couple of sessions before, both in Agile and Design, which were on the advanced webinar, and this is a colloquium that is not, it's not the advanced webinar. We had a bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a confusion, but there were some people who themselves were perhaps experts in Agile and design thinking. The Agile coaching advanced webinar or colloquium, I'm not sure which, I think Dharmesh conducted, and there was a design thinking one, which we had a couple of weeks ago or last week, which was by Susan, who's got a PhD in it. And so there was probably a feeling from some that, yeah, we know a lot about it, we were not involved. Yes, we try our best, and if you guys have the kind of specialized knowledge in these subjects, we would be delighted to have you on board as on panel or in future. And also, these are 1 hour sessions, and the intention is not to make you experts in any of these. By attending this 1 hour of colloquium or webinar or whatever, you're not going to become an Agile certified coach or a design thinking certified specialist or what have you. So it's primarily intended to provide some basic knowledge about these processes as linked to coaching. And then after that, if you have your own interest, you can go deeper into it. And we're also planning to have mastery webinars, which might be conducted as independent programs where some of these topics will be addressed by specialists. So at that point in time, there could be an opportunity to go deeper into this. And also there are multiple sources. For example, design thinking, IDEO there. Acumen provides a number of free courses. I have done several courses with them. There are many other ways of how to acquire that knowledge. So today in Barrett, for instance, the reason I selected Barrett is because as part of the systemic coaching work that I do, very often the question that is asked is, what is the state of the organization? What is the cultural state of the organization? We will go into that question of what is culture and so on in a few minutes' time. Assuming that we have an answer to what is culture and how it is defined, there are certain measurement techniques, surveys, and so on, which evaluate this culture as seen by the individuals in the organization. Because the organization by itself doesn't have a face, it doesn't have an entity. So the members of that organization are the ones who sort of evaluate and define what the culture of that organization is, based on which the state of the culture of the organization can be in some way evaluated. That the organization is a transparent organization, it's an openly communicative organization, or it's a closed organization, it's an authoritative organization, it's an empowering organization, and so on and so forth. One of the tools that I have come across, which is being used globally when I did some work with a couple of multinationals, was Barrett. It is universally respected as a very credible and valid evaluation tool. And I found it extremely useful, though quite confusing. I had to learn a lot. I was not trained in it, but people who had used it for several years guided me, and and the results we obtained were pretty fairly good. I'll explain it later as a case study after Dharmesh and Ashok talk about their systems as well. And later, after I had used it and tried it, perhaps it's pure serendipity, that I came across Ashok's Hume model. This was a couple of years ago. And that really sort of staggered me because he had developed it in India, and this model could be used for exactly the same purpose that I had worked with Barrett, though I had not done the initial work that was done by a multinational in Europe. And I found that there were major advantages of using Hume over Barrett in a way, at least from my perspective in systemic coaching. So I would share that with you as well. And Ashok would set a background to it. The interesting part is both these methodologies, tools, assessment techniques, surveys, whatever name you want to give it, doesn't matter what. They are based on the same framework, and it's called the Graves model, the Graves model of consciousness. And the Graves model, for those of you who might be familiar, is based on Maslow's. Graves developed it as an alternative, as an improvement over Maslow's. In some ways it is, some ways it may not be. And Barrett adapted it, and it became the standard tool for it. Hume, in a different way, works with Graves' model. Uh, and the essence of the Graves model, as I see it, which is spiral dynamics. Some of you may be familiar with spiral dynamics. Beck and other people have worked on spiral. These are fairly sophisticated, refined, and advanced techniques. So the average coach may not necessarily be familiar with all this. So the purpose of having this conversation today is just to expose you to the possibilities. And then you can go in deeper into it. Like, for example, Ken Wilber has written a book, what is it called? Theory of Everything, something like that, where he goes into details about spiral dynamics. It's amazing book. It's really a combination of philosophy, psychology, spirituality, everything that you want to put into it, leadership and coaching and all that stuff. So these are some of the things that we would at least touch upon today. I don't know how much we'll be able to do. So let me stop here at this point in time. And once again, let me invite if any one of you here in this group of about 50 odd people, and if you have any background in actual training with Barrett, please let us know. Otherwise, yeah, Dharmesh, if you could just start with your presentation, keep it brief, and then Ashok can come in, and then we can get into whatever questions are coming up from the chat box. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ram. Good morning, good evening, and to everyone. I see that people from all parts of the world. Glad to see that. I would say that I'm honored as well as excited to be in front of such a learned audience and an experienced audience. So um, let's quickly go into this. What I would request everyone is in the chat window, if you can put down in terms of what is your meaning of organizational culture. I think that is something that would help. And I would quickly then go through my journey and experience with the Barrett's model. As Ram mentioned, I don't have any formal training in Barrett, but because of my passion in terms of building the values-driven organization, the book from Barrett, which I came across, and then I started reading it. And then as I was going through the agile transformation in a company, I was an agile coach there. And I was seeing certain characteristics in the environment. And as an observer, I knew that there is something that needs to be solved. And I was struggling in terms of how to solve that. And that is where I felt that the Barrett's model would work wonderful. So what I saw in the environment was it was a political environment. Just before starting the transformation, there were quite a few management layoffs that happened because people wanted to reduce the management overheads. So that was also the other issues, that people were feeling insecure, and that is where there was blaming. However, the people were committed and at the same time very intelligent, motivated, capable people. um, I was helping them in terms of the transformation, but this is what I observed more at a management level. So in one of the management retrospectives, in order to measure the culture, I tried this Barrett's assessment into without even telling them about that this is Barrett or this is anything. And that was the thing. Okay. So I see that, yeah, people have written in terms of what is the culture or organizational culture. Yeah, personality of an organization, behavior of people, collective manifestation of choices, actions, behaviors. Yes. So you're all on the right track. One of the very good definition that I've come across is that it is the way the people behave when no one is looking. Because we find that in today's organization, many times people behave differently when they are being watched, and people behave very differently when they are not being watched. Okay. Um, uh, Ram, anything you want to add in terms of the definition of culture?
No, that's absolutely a brilliant definition. Yeah, the way people behave when they're not. So there was a company that I used to work for. The chairman of the company once told me that we need to define organization culture. So I said, everybody has his own definition of what is organization culture. He said, what I mean by that is in the middle of the night, if I wake you up, what would you like to say about this organization? And that's what the organization culture should be. So it's something very similar. Yeah, please go on.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. So now, as a small piece, what I would request is that you're seeing certain characteristics or the values on the screen. Don't worry about the color or anything. But like Ram said, right, when someone wakes you up or when you look at your organization or your team, what are the key characteristics that you see from this? And if you have pen and paper handy, just write down 5 to 10 of these. Okay. Because the way people behave is will be related to, and I'm sure that you would be able to relate to this. And this is just a assessment that I picked up from the Barrett site and modified a bit, but this is something that can be customized as per the organization and the way the people talk on the different values about it. Okay. So I'll just give a moment in terms of for the people to just read about the different values and at least note it in their mind, the top 5 or 10, and then I will talk about the Barrett's model. Okay.
And we can share this on the blog later as well. So if you don't have a chance, you can look at it later.
So one thing you will also observe that you will see that there are some positive characteristics and there are some negative characteristics in this one. Okay. And the way the Barrett's assessment is that what is the current culture that you see based on these values, and then what is your desired culture that you want to see in the organization. Okay. So if everyone is at
Yeah, I
least
mean,
has few values, yeah, go ahead, Ram.
just to add to you, Damesh, and when I work with several organizations today, some of the stuff that pretty clearly comes up when we talk to the senior team, as it were, somewhere it is about silo mentalities, short-term focus. Those are the kind of, sorry, can
Sorry,
you go
yeah,
back? Yeah.
yeah,
And manipulation, for example. Of course, that's very high. That's not a great thing to be. But certainly silo mentality and short-term focus, pretty clearly, 80% of the companies that I work with, very, very clearly it is exhibited. And there are certain other adjectives, not walking the talk and not being open, etc., could be there. Openness, for example, absence of openness, those kind of things. So that gives a very clear assessment of, uh, and people who work inside a company, especially when these are being administered anonymously, they have no problems in picking up and saying, hey, this is how I view the company. And we will go into the diagnosis later. And I'm sure you will cover as the other part of it, what
yeah,
people want it to be, etc. later. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So that's a good thing. So other thing is also when people are giving the assessment is you can write lack of openness or lack of trust or lack of integrity. That's also the other way to look at it. And what I find in the most of our organizations, as far as from the agile perspective, is the resistance to change. People are extremely resistant in terms of changing the organization to take the risk that is required in order to change that. So other thing also you will observe that company has their core values or the core ethics most of the companies would have. And similarly, this type of assessment gets done at organizational level. Like in one of the company, they found that core value did not even figure in the cultural values assessment that they did. And similarly, you can also do a personal values assessment. Okay. So now let's just explain the how the Barrett has classified the consciousness levels. So in terms of how the Barrett has classified the consciousness levels is 7 from as it comes from the Graves model. So first is the survival, where you will see the organizational behavior is more focused on the financial stability and stock price. So if that is the case, you will see that there is more of a corruption, greed, and the leadership you will see is more of a crisis manager, and the individuals who are working there are just working for the pay. This is my 9 to 5 job, and as long as I get pay, I don't care about anything else. The second level then consists of the relationship, where at an organizational level people care a lot more about the relationship, and same thing with the leadership. So that is where when people care about more relationship, the performance gets compromised, and because you will be partial to the people, you might recognize certain people where you have more relationships more, and that is where the manipulation and the blame comes into the picture. The third one is in terms of the self-esteem, and once that is where people focus on the performance and the high performance, and that is where you see that many organizations today are talking about, okay, I want to improve the productivity, or I want to get the things done in cheaper, faster, and it should be better. So these are some of the words that I hear a lot. But that is where you see that there is a lot of bureaucracy, because people want control and people are looking at productivity. At the same time, there is a complacency because there is not sense of a responsibility as a whole. So this is the in terms of the self-esteem, and individual is just thinking about their individual growth. And this is where, as Ram mentioned, the siloed mentality, the growing in power, growing in status comes into the picture. Then the fourth one is in terms of the transformation, where people talk about, okay, from the goal perspective, how does we learn continuously, and how do we empower the team? How do we encourage more and more teamwork? And this is where you see the leadership would be the influencer, and they will talk more in terms of innovation, empowerment, and give the freedom for the people, so that people can take risk and produce certain innovative stuff. Uh, the fifth one is internal cohesion, which talks about the shared values, vision, passion, commitment. And this is where you will see that people are talking the same language. All the people in the organization, you will see the similar characteristics in that one. Sixth one is in terms of the making a difference, where we talk about more coaching, mentoring, partnering, strategic alliances, and collaborating with like-minded people. So if you look at this colloquium, right, it's more collaborating with like-minded people, and often we call different people, Peter Hawkins and similarly many others, in terms of helping to share the knowledge. And then the last one, seventh one, is in terms of the service, where it is more in terms of service to humanity. How do we make the humanity better from the long-term perspective? So these are the 7 levels, and it is really amazing to see from my perspective that, yeah, how that is mapped to the organizational behavior, the individual leadership values, and the individuals who are working there, the values of that.
Dharmesh, just to add to this while
Yeah.
you're still on the slide, later all of you will get these slides and you can look back on these, compare the previous adjectives list and this, and you'll find Many of those which are marked here, some of them in red at the first three and others up, these adjectives figured in that adjective list. So the way the survey works is that based on the adjectives that you select, there is a process of putting them into these 7 levels of consciousness. And based on that, totally, where is the organization at in totality is how it is measured. That is how the measurement actually takes place.
Yeah.
It's a fairly simple, transparent process.
Yeah. So what I would ask you is, as you have noted down certain characteristics, just look at it in terms of which are the levels of consciousness seems predominant in your group or in your organization. And normally what I have seen, it's 2 or 3 levels would be predominant. From my experience, what I see is that the agile transformation that I'm talking about and the group I was talking about, 1, 2, and 3 were predominant, while there were some aspects of 4 of continuous learning and influencing and the empowerment, but it was more in terms of the bureaucracy, relationship, recognition, not talking bad about others. 2 and 3 were very predominant as far as the current culture. And when asked about the desired culture, people came up with the 4th and the 5th level as more of a desired culture. So in addition to 3rd one, because they wanted high performance, but people came up with 4th and 5th, some of the adjectives related in that. So it was really good to see that. And when we measured it after 9 months, there were more people talking about the current culture in terms of the level 4, and some of them were talking more in terms of mentoring and coaching, just a few people. The another concept I want to bring in is what Barrett calls it is a cultural entropy. So as Ram mentioned, the red ones, the negative values are the ones that Barrett calculates in terms of the cultural entropy. So out of all the answers, the percentage of the negative characteristics that are there, that is a cultural entropy. And if that number of negative values are more than 30%, that means that there are serious issues in the organization. It will need some structural changes. It will need some leadership changes, lot in terms of the leadership, coaching, mentoring, maybe HR initiative to see how the culture can be changed. And these are that is where the coaching engagement, and I'm sure Ashok will talk about it in terms of his experience with organization in terms of the coaching engagement, that how you engage with the organization at a systemic level for the organizational culture transformation. So we'll stop here. If there are any questions on this one, Barrett, I will take it. Otherwise, I'll pass it on to Ashok for Yum's model.
Let me just add a couple of
Sure.
comments. One is Prem has asked about, there's a lot of chat about values assessment. Is there a short list of the essential? No, it's deliberate. There are over 100 adjectives and people are allowed to choose what they wish from there. They choose about 10 to reflect what the organization current status is, and 10 in terms of the desired status, and another 10 about generally what they see around the world in their experience about how organizations are. Ashok will go into greater detail because he designed Yum in a similar way, how those things happen. And as already Dharmesh mentioned, most organizations, let's be very clear, I don't see really many organizations out in this world, in the corporate world, who are going to be high on 6 and 7. Very, very unlikely. They are all mostly likely to be in 3, 4, 5. And the 4 is really the tipping point where they move into high gear, as it were. So if an organization is really good at 4 and 5, with a little bit of 3, because there is a certain amount of focus on performance, etc., is required, that organization would pretty much be a successful, sustainable organization. In a very, very simplistic way, we can keep discussing the negatives of that. So I'll go into the deeper case study aspect of it later. But the most important contribution of the Barretts is really the concept of entropy, where especially looking at the number 1 and 2, survival relationship parameters, and 3 to some extent, those values which are highlighted in red, if they figure much more frequently, as you said, absolutely right, it's about 30% and above, then the organization is in serious trouble. An organization where these negatives are less than 10% is considered to be fairly successful. It's likely to be, if you were to use the Jim Collins kind of approach, the good to great, they will be the great companies. Maybe 10 to 20 will be sort of good ones, and anything about 20 is going to lead you into trouble. But we'll go into some other chat later. But Ashok, if you could just come in with the other slide of explaining the spiral dynamic model of Hume, as well as whatever it is there is to explain about Hume.
Ram, difficult to explain Hume in a few minutes. Let me say that there
okay.
is...
Yeah, so give a brief overview of Hume, and then I'll take it over from there and then put it in perspective in terms of actual usage. Yeah.
Let me say there are lots of parallels with Barrett. So let me focus on some of the differences, in terms of perhaps that would highlight what Hume is a little more clearly. So first thing is that in Hume, we don't talk so much of culture. We talk more of identity. That the basic premise here is that organizations are living systems, and over a period of time, they develop an identity of their own. And culture is such a term which has so many meanings. So by identity, we actually mean three things. One, the way in which the organization looks at itself. Two, the way in which it looks at its environment. And three, some of its set patterns of engagement, both internal and external. So because all organizations get stuck with certain patterns which are repetitive. So these are the three main components. So what we do in Hume is essentially map the identity of the organization in terms of where it is. And we believe very strongly that everything else, like we often say that identity precedes strategy, that your strategy has to be aligned to the identity that the organization has. It is important to understand what that identity is. Now, there are obviously parallels with there are identity configurations which are corresponding to the consciousness levels which are talked of in Barrett. This is not quite Graves, but it's more like Maslow than Graves. But Graves also has, certain levels of existence that he has talked about. But we have departed from Graves. And to that extent, there is a clear difference. And I think the major difference is that in Graves, he uses the term levels, and these levels are taken as steady states. That you move, there is a steady state, and from one steady state, you move to another steady state. From that steady state, you move to another steady state. In Hume, we don't use the term level, we use the term universes. And we say that these universes exist simultaneously. That at any point in time, so for instance, if I relate to the Barrett's consciousness levels, it's not that the organization which is not in the survival state has dealt with all the issues of that, or it is in the relationship state. So these issues of survival, issues of relationship, issues of self-esteem, issues of transformation, they are all existing simultaneously. So how are these configured is what we focus on. So we don't talk of, that this level is this level is this. So there are positives and negatives in each of these universes. Even the so-called higher universes, we don't like to use the word higher or lower. We say that, okay, even some of the latter universes, like for instance, here are the universes that we talked about. There's the universe of belonging and protection, which is somewhat similar to what you would call the relationship orientation, survival and relationship. Strength and desire would have a parallel with what you would call um, self-esteem, roles and boundaries would perhaps figure somewhere in between. Purpose and achievement would be somewhere somewhat similar to what you would call transformation. So there are essentially, the basic model is that all living systems, whether it be an individual or an organization, is simultaneously whole in itself and it's part of a larger whole. And its evolution is actually a movement, and that's why the spiral from parthood to wholeness to parthood to wholeness. So on this side, the universes of belonging and protection, roles and boundaries, meaningfulness and intimacy, etc. These are universes which emphasize on the parthood of the organization, whereas the others emphasize on its wholeness, that it's whole in itself. So essentially, through Jung, what you do is you map the current configuration and you look at what are its implications are. What are some of the ways in which what you use the word entropy, where it may have got stuck. And there is entropy not in just the lower universes, but in higher universes as well. How best it can deal, because we believe that each of these universes has something useful to tell us, something useful to contribute. Just as it has something useful to contribute, it has some pitfalls as well. So, how well is that universe configured in the individual or the organization is what is significant. And when it comes to things like coaching or working with the system, where it helps is because you're using the same framework, uh, like for understanding the individual and the organization, it becomes easy to relate. Like, for instance, the universe of belonging and protection, the organizational equivalent is clan. For universe of strength and desire, the organizational equivalent is arena. So each of these has a corresponding organizational equivalent. So you see to what extent, where is the identity of the individual, where is the identity of the organization, how are the two interfacing with each other, what are some of the functionalities of it, what are some of the dysfunctionalities of it. That's the way we work with you. I don't know, have I answered your question, Ram?
Yeah. Let's leave it at this point in time, and then we'll come back to some of the, let's say, subtleties of that later. So, Dharmesh, if we don't need this slide, if you could just stop sharing the slides. Yeah. So, I mean, I just would like to go back to something fairly simple. That is, what are we using this for? I'm trying to exit full screen. Okay. The whole purpose of this exercise is to, many organizations tell me that, look, I want to have a culture of collaborative teams. My leadership team is not really a team. It's a group of people and who work purely for their own personal benefits most often, and get together when they need something from other people. They are fragmented, they are siloed. And this is pretty much 80% of what happens in most parts of the world with most companies. And I think people are very myopic if they don't really see that happening. And just like, for example, you use a psychometric test, for instance, Hogan or something, in order to be able to find out what the blind spots are, the derailers, or those kind of things. Or, for example, if you use a Johari's windows for personal assessment, what is that blind window which you don't know about but others see? And what a good consultant or a coach or a trainer from outside coming in there would be able to see and be able to tell you by watching the behavior of that company. And the company may not want to believe that. So these tests, be it Barrett, be it Jung, allow us to be able to pretty much show the mirror to those companies to say where you are at this point in time and define it specifically. So just to, and the question is maybe, so what? What if I know this is how where it is? Fortunately, I think that so what question is getting less and less in corporations today, because people are in such an amount of tension and pressure in terms of stakeholders and others in terms of behaving properly, be it harassment suits or not treating their stakeholders properly and so on and so forth. Everybody would like to at least make sure that their basic behavior, what Dharmesh and one of the things is expressed as the core values or the ethics, are in conformance with at least the legal requirements prevalent in those countries. And the good news is that once you understand what the organizational cultural state is, and also where majority of the people really would like the organization to go, it is not that difficult to work towards moving that. It's very often just the behavior of about a dozen people on top, and of course, obviously the CEO, which very often sets the tone and the tune for the rest of the organization to follow. The top leader, if he is aggressive, abrasive, and whatever else the negativity criteria that you want to provide there, manipulative and so on and so forth, the entire organization then starts believing that's perfectly fine. Somebody asked about, Kathleen said, looks like this could refer to governments. Absolutely. Over a period of time, sad to say, and these are there in the Hindu scriptures actually, the way that the leader is, that is how the population is going to be. And that's what happens over a period of time. The whole culture deteriorates to that point, unless there are other safeguards in the system which shift it back into a better kind of a position. So I had worked with a company where this was done, and the chief executive initiated it. And the chief executive was, in many senses, was perceptive, wise, and really wanted to showcase what the heck was going on in the company. And then the entropy of that company was somewhere around about 27, 28, which was just a little lower than what would be called the disaster level, but sufficiently bad. And there was the initial level. I worked with many of there were 20 people at the top, leaders. I worked with them individually, talked to them, found out how did they interpret these values when they applied these, because the majority, I mean, they were part of the larger group which provided this information. How do you, in a sense, align with these results? Do you agree with that? And many of them actually did. Many of them, for some ways, were far more forceful about the negative state of the organization than even what came up. And then we had a couple of days of group sessions with those people, based on which they figured out what is the value system that they would like to go to based on some of the things that were put up there as a desired values. It was not much of a, it was pretty much a no-brainer, moving from a closed, non-communicative, dishonest kind of unclear communication to something more open. How do we do that? Those kind of things. At the end of the day, you do find that most of the people really want to do the good thing by everybody. They're not there to make a dishonest living. And they worked on it. They had open communication systems, all kinds of stuff, marketplaces and whatever, town hall meetings and so on and so forth. And in about 6 to 9 months, there was a very, very distinct improvement. Actually, 9 months later, when they did another dipstick, that was about, it had come down to, entropy level had come down to about 15. So it is possible. It's not as if it's all downward from this point that you've identified that something is going wrong. So in the hands of good leadership and in the hands of reasonably perceptive coaching approach, and especially if you apply a systemic coaching approach, it is possible to move from a negative state of cultural values, the entropic state, into a much more powerful kind of position to be in. And the other way that did help me as well, and this is where I want to go a little more detail in this with Ashok, is in one organization, and he's aware of this, I worked with him on this. When we did the initial survey itself, we found that apart from many things, apart from the fact that this organization was, and again, let me back up a little bit. the first three levels of survival, relationship, and self-esteem, it's not that it's all bad. You need it for an organization to be founded. You have to have your feet on the ground, unless you have your health of the company properly, which is indicated by survival. And if you have a proper relationship in terms of the systems and you have the self-esteem in terms of the performance, an organization is not going to work. So it's just that if you focus just on that, it is like a person focusing totally about one's own selfish needs and not caring about anything else. And where does that one lead someone to? And that's the reason why then you need the fourth stage from which you start shifting into the transformational aspect and to maybe some of the higher ones. So is there a balance? So in a sense, I don't know, I'm being very practical here, I'm very pragmatic, and I want some of you people, as you are seeing maybe you looked at the slides or whatever, I would be much happier with an organization which is just at level 4 or 5, somewhere there, because that organization is likely to be very well balanced in terms of where it is, in terms of its idealism and in terms of its selfish needs and so on, and to be able to do that. It's like something like, for example, in MBTI, my own assessment of the thing is many of these profilers of MBTI would talk about personalities in the shape of some metaphors and so on and so forth. It makes no sense to me, because they would classify a 15%, 51% J as a J and a 49% P as a J. And similarly, it makes no difference at all. If your scores in an MBTI, those of you who are familiar with MBTI, are between 40 and 60, it's really the best. You are situationally fantastic because you can move into either which way that you want. And you would be a phenomenally powerful leader, which is really what in later day measurements like Hogan, Luminger, Harrison's, and so on, you have the middle range of 30 to 70, which is considered to be excellent. If you're over 70 and if you're less than 30, you're going to have problems. And then you can deal with what needs to be done with those particular problems. The derailers are usually the extreme ends of both sides. So if someone is measured as whatever, a general or a savior or something on the basis of the fact, 51-49, that kind of distribution, or 55-45, it's pretty moronic. I mean, it just doesn't work at all. Okay, sorry to use that word. Similarly, in cultural surveys as well, I think there has to be much greater sensitivity in terms of how they measure entropy. I don't know the specific algorithm or formula that they use for measuring the entropy, but if it is just by picking up a few words and being able to do that, whether it really reflects it or not, I wouldn't know. So someone who had used Barrett for almost about 30 years, that person told me, I said, look, I've talked to many people who are supposedly experts on this in this company. They had a team of people who had worked with Barrett for several years, but this outsider I contacted just to make sure that I got things right. And her response was that what you're doing is absolutely right, going to each individual and asking them, the top leaders, how do you interpret the values that you assigned in the Barrett survey, and why was it that you used that? And from that, you will get much more information about the organizational culture and how it is affecting the organization than just going by the scores and so on and so forth. And that's what I eventually did. And then when we had a sort of group session and so on and so forth, and moved it down to individual sessions with a larger community, that helped us to sort of bring out a change. In the other company that I'm still working, and where I use human instead of Barrett, because by that time I had got some experience with human. I respect that a lot, and I wasn't that familiar with Barrett, and also Barrett is extremely expensive. And when we did that, one of the things that came out from it is not that well explained in the spiral that Ashok showed. But one of the things was that the organization is, the individuals they feel bad about things, but they're not willing to say it out loud. And it came out extremely powerfully. And so before we actually went into a 2-day session with a group, generally, my approach would be in what we call the speed process, which is there on the Kucharya website. My approach usually is to help build the team by asking them to share about powerful changes that they have had and other people to appreciate and so on. But based on this, I had a chat with Ashok before I went into this group session, and then I spoke to the CEO and the CHRO. I said, look, I find that already your whole system is such that they are far too diplomatic. They are far too polite for their own good. And if I ask them to be appreciative, they will go one step more, and it'll all be, I don't know what the heck is going to happen. Yeah, buttering up each person, it's not going to help. So I said, if you would allow me, I would like to light a fire in the system and see what happened. That I really want to see some of them. Some of the first reaction would be, this is not the way a coach should behave. Possibly, yes. But maybe I think this is the way a systemic coach should behave, because you want to get the organization and team dynamics moving. So I just told them, I said, look, this is what I find from your studies. And I find that all of you are very, very polite to each other. But I don't know whether you really mean what you say, and you're being polite for the good reasons and so on. So let's talk about a few issues that have been bothering you for a long time. Let's not talk about the good things that you have done. Let's talk about what is it that today is keeping you awake at night. And started with that and really started putting a little more pressure on them. But something amazing happened over the day. There was initially, it was almost like it went into a peak where people literally came to blows, each one blaming the other person. And then we got them down into looking at each other in a slightly different way. By the end of the day, each one said, yeah, we understand what the other person's problem is, why it is happening, and so on and so forth. There was a phenomenal difference in the way that people started interacting. And then, in fact, we did a 2-day work, and some of the work that was done later, it was postponed. Recently, I got a call from them saying, no, we want you to come back. Much of the stuff that was done, it had such amazingly powerful effect. Now, we would like to take the whole movement forward. So we will probably do another dipstick later to find out. So Ashok, the point I really am coming to here is, yeah, somebody said artificial harmony. Yeah, very, very true. It's about this social.
Can I come in, Ram?
Yeah, please.
Building on what you were saying and the thing that you said earlier as to what's the objective of all this. As far as I'm concerned, the objective is very simple: to expand the meaning that people have given to a certain phenomenon. People get stuck in it. Like you talked about collaboration. Now, I've often seen that most people believe that they are collaborating, but they are collaborating in a way which they think is collaboration. So many times this artificial harmony for some people is a way of collaboration. Being nice to each other is a way of collaboration. Pushing uncomfortable issues under the carpet is a way of collaboration. So the moment people get stuck in a particular meaning, so if you tell them start collaborating, the person says, look, I'm already collaborating. The idea is for the person to begin to see that what this person or that system as a whole has looked at, it has given it a certain meaning. How can you expand that meaning? Not challenge that meaning, not say that your meaning is wrong, but to say that how can there be a greater meaning? How can there be new ways of collaborating? How can there be new ways of engaging with certain kinds of things? To me, I think that is really the purpose of all such interventions.
Basically, Ashok, yeah, whether it is collaboration or something else, when we talk about open communication, people come back and say, oh, but we are open. We tell everybody what it is and so on and so forth. But the people down the line feel they're not walking the talk. But the other important thing that I noticed is just the same way as I found that at any point in time in any organization, It is not that the organization is moving from one level to another level.
Yes.
It's impossible. But there are multiple levels are operating at different situations in different
Absolutely.
ways. It's almost like situational leadership. Here you have situational consciousness, etc.
How are they configuring with each other? I think it's
Each
a
other.
mix.
Yeah.
That's important. Not that, you at one level, you go from one level to another. Absolutely.
Which is where I found that the Jung model, in terms of that spiral dynamic part, which is really the original Graves' approach to it, rather than the pyramidal structure, far more. Would you like to say, I remember vaguely, I don't know exactly what you meant by that. You used to say that the left-hand side of it means something, the right-hand side of it means something, in that belonging and so on and so forth. What would that mean in terms of an organizational behavior?
Well, one side is in terms of where you feel that you are whole in yourself, where the emphasis is on your wholeness. On the other side, the emphasis is on your parthood. So that, for instance, when you say that, what purpose is, let's say, when one uses a thing like SWOT analysis, then one is actually looking at the organization as whole in itself, which is looking at what the opportunities and threats of the environment are and how best to maximize them for yourself. Whereas when you talk of what you talked about, larger responsibility, you are looking at the organization not just as an entity, not just as an autonomous, atomized entity, but as an entity which is part of a larger whole. So on one side, emphasizes both are real. Whether it's in an individual or an organization, they are both part of a larger context and they are also whole in themselves. So one side represents the parthood, the other side represents the wholeness.
So which side represents the wholeness? The right side?
Yeah, the strength and desire, purpose and achievement,
Yeah.
duality. That's the one where the emphasis is that you are autonomous, independent, whole in yourself.
So if a particular company, you find that generally people are coming out much more to be in these universes, especially strength and desire and purpose and achievement.
That's
Strength
right.
and desire is pretty much about individual stars,
That's right.
summarize.
That's
Whereas a
right.
purpose and achievement actually might mean almost the opposite, that they are willing to sacrifice for the sake of another person, and they are collaborative and so on. So
no, in the Hume terms, purpose and achievement doesn't mean that.
okay.
In the Hume frame, it means willingness to forge mutually beneficial relationships.
Okay.
So there is a simultaneity of both collaboration and competition in purpose and achievement.
Okay.
So it has both. So your idea is that I am a node in the system.
Yeah.
So the organizational equivalent of UPA is network, where you say every individual is an autonomous node.
Yeah.
And this node relates to other nodes in ways which are mutually beneficial. So the emphasis is still on your own wholeness.
Okay.
Though you also recognize the existence of the other.
So therefore, a company, an organization which is strong on these factors, strength and desire and purpose and achievement, they are more focused on the wholeness of the organization.
That's right.
Rather than the parts.
That's
so
right.
What does that mean in terms of its own either people engagement or task engagement?
Well, some of the implications are that relationship with people would be of a more of contractual professional nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The emphasis will be in terms of what the individual brings to the table. Right? The individual will have a sense that will be preoccupied with the fear of obsolescence. That if I become obsolete, I'll be valued only so long as I have something to give. That I'm not valued as a human being. I'm only valued in terms of what I can offer. The organization's relationship with its, other partners, etc., will be essentially of a transactional nature.
Okay, interesting. So if the organization is therefore more centered on the left side, which is the belonging, roles, boundaries, and meaningful and intimacy,
Yeah,
that means, in a sense, people might feel safer.
that's right. Yes.
That's very, very interesting.
The
Because in
people
many
will,
organizations, especially in tech space, I think Dharmesh will be able to confirm that by the time they reach 40, people.
I lost you. Yeah. Hello.
Magda, I think we are not able to
Yeah,
hear you.
Ram,
Yeah.
Ram, can
Yeah,
you hear us? I think your headphones unplugged or something, because you're not muted, but
and
we
we
can't
Can you
hear
hear me
anything you're
now?
saying. Yes,
Yeah,
we can now.
we
Yeah.
heard the last. We missed the last part.
So many of the companies today, um, technology-oriented companies,
Yeah.
that at the age of 40, there is this feeling that it's a tipping point. I mean, unless we reinvent ourselves or something happens, and I move from a functional to a larger general management or something else where my wisdom counts rather than my knowledge, then probably they don't have a place to stay.
Yeah.
So, and those organizations are probably much more working on the right side of this cycle than the others who are willing to sort of say, okay, we will take care of you either which way.
That's right.
But whether the organization will be successful in the long run, I don't know. So, what is your experience, Dharmesh?
That's
Just
true.
before
Means I
that,
have heard.
Ramesh, can I just add
Yeah,
one
go ahead.
thing? See, essentially, organizations on the right side look at themselves as a instrument, as a purposive machine, which has a certain things to be delivered. The ones on the left side look at themselves as human communities. The reality is that an organization is both. It's both
Wow.
a human community and a purposive instrument. One
Okay.
side emphasizes the purposive instrument part, the other side emphasizes the human community part. Yeah, over to you,
Yes.
Dharmesh. Sorry.
Yeah. No, what you said is absolutely right. What I've heard with my friend in Bangalore is that in the startups, they don't take people who are over 40 because they want them to work a lot, and at the same time, they want to achieve a lot more in a shorter duration. So, yeah. And
Okay, Dharmesh, if you can, if you can sort of stop sharing the screen, we are pretty much almost, and I don't think there are any other major questions. I mean, unless either of you, well, again, once again, to repeat that the purpose of this whole exercise was just to bring to the awareness of people that one of the dilemmas that I always have is when I ask to do systemic work, and it's important to know where the organization is at. And it's very difficult to get that by traditional assessment techniques. Even if I do a 360 or whatever, it's about one person or two persons. It cannot be for the whole. And so there are very, very few instruments which are available, like whether it's Barrett or Yum. And I tend to use Yum more and more at this point in time. And it, so just to let, I mean, would like to get the feedback from you as well. What are the things that you people are using? How do you, if at all you are doing any systemic work, how does that happen? And this is one of the areas that you would like to discuss more. Some of you know that April we are having this session with Peter Hawkins in Mumbai, 14 to 16. So hope to see as many of you there as possible. We're going to be deeper into this. And we are hoping that the whole community of systemic coaches, we could possibly develop this in the next couple of years. So we are at the forefront in the world, as it were, to be able to tackle this. So I'll leave it to both of you to just close the session, please.
so just one thing I would say is, again, as a systemic coach, sometimes the exact same skills as an individual coach may or may not apply. You need to modify it, because when you are working with the group and the group dynamics, it's really important if you know their personal values and at least you have some rapport. Even when I did the exercises, it was I have to wait for a certain period of time till that rapport is there, and I know that the people would open up. And also, as Ram mentioned, people will come against each other, And again, that is where the power of a systemic coach and how to facilitate those type of situations and convert them into a constructive movement forward is the key. So that is where I would conclude. Yeah.
Thanks,
See,
Dharmesh.
as I see it, the basic thing of systemic coaching rests on the famous Kurt Lewin equation. Behavior is a function of self and situation. And I think any coaching must take into account both the individual and the context. Now, whether you do it through Barrett, whether you do it through Hume, or whether you only do it through a conversation, it is important to understand what is the context of this individual. You can't work with an individual without taking into account the context. To me, that's the basic logic of systemic coaching. And that's where
Absolutely
its
right.
power is.
Very
Totally
true.
right, Ashok.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, the foundation of all systemic coaching, to my mind, is organizational development. That's Kurt Lewin. And today, people like Otto Scharmer and so on, the way they are working, and they are taking systemic coaching to completely a different level, which is ecological, ecosystemic kind of levels, which is absolutely brilliant. So yeah, as we move on, we're trying to see if we can get Otto Scharmer on one of our colloquiums, but let's see if it works. Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys, for being
Thank you, Ram.
patient.
Thank you,
Stay with us.
everyone. Thank you for all the people. Thank you, Dharmesh. Thank you,
Thanks,
Mantra.
Ashok. Thanks, Ram.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mukunda.
everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.